Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a very sincere thank you to Talentmark, particularly to David and William for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I have to say I was a little surprised to be invited, and I stand here finding myself wondering slightly why I am here. One potential reason is that I am a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and as such I'm pleased to be here. I was one of the youngest of the fellows in the modern history of the college, and it's almost 20 years since I was last here. I was also one of the youngest fellows in the modern history to quit the profession some 6 months after I got my fellowship, and since that time I've been working in the pharmaceutical and life sciences industries as a consultant, and doing my best with a pretty mixed track record, I think it's fair to say, of trying to look into the future and help clients adapt to what is coming down the line. So what I'm going to do, if I may, is briefly, and I will try and be quick because I know there are many other things to do other than to listen to me this evening, is paint a small picture of some ideas about the future of the innovative pharmaceutical industry. So what I'm going to do is start a long way back with some etymology, because it occurred to me that Futureceuticals is a word that I didn't completely understand, and I thought I might just try and understand my brief a little better by having a look at that. So I think we all know about the word future, and that comes from the Latin futurus, which is all about the future. I won't try and articulate the various grammatical phrases that come with that definition or that origin. Pharmaceutical, I think, is more interesting. This comes from the Latin, which in turn comes from the Greek for, in English, preparer of drugs or poisoner, and indeed from the Greek pharmakon, which is for medicine or poison. So I thought that was quite an interesting insight from my perspective. So futureceutical is actually a neologism, and a neologism is a new word, as you know, and I thought it would be a newer word than it appears to be, because if you type futureceuticals into Google, you get 42,800 results. I didn't waste the time to find out who came up with that word first, but unfortunately it wasn't Talentmark. What is a neologism? Well, just to complete the picture, this comes from a French origin from 1803. Okay, so in 1997, this was a view of the future as we saw it. And like I said, mixed success here. What this Farm Future article, dated in 2002, bearing in mind we were 5 years prior, talked about was consolidation in the industry. And we did correctly identify that GSK would come to exist in the year 2000, as it turned out, and that AstraZeneca also would come together in 1999. What we didn't get quite so right was perhaps the enthusiasm and optimism with which new drugs and blockbusters would be brought to market quickly and smartly, and the extent to which pipelines would be so burgeoning that everyone would be out-licensing their candidates in the plethora of success. So that was that. If I take you forward to another consulting organization, actually just 3 or 4 years ago, called Defined Health, they saw the future a little bit differently, and this is their summary. So we've got about a year to go before Big Pharma meets its end, according to this organization. What I'd like to do is just perhaps be a little bit more optimistic than that, and talk about some of the reasons why I think that might be the case, if not for Big Pharma, at least for the innovative pharmaceutical industry. So again, looking back a little way, I thought this was a very interesting advert. I guess many of you who travel will have seen this in airports around the world, courtesy of HSBC, who actually did some fairly diligent work in putting some of these analyses together by sourcing information from a range of places, and this comes from a guy called Glenn Heemstra, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, from The Futurist. And this asserts that 2/3 of the people who are currently alive, age 65 and over, are alive today compared with the population of over 65-year-olds in the history of time, which says something rather dramatic about the aging of the population. So looking forward a little way, according to the United Nations, the average age of the world's population is going to almost double by the end of this century. And without wanting to state the obvious, all of us know that healthcare spending per capita increases as the population ages. And that's because, obviously, patients become more sick, more healthcare interventions are required. And also, I think, looking forward, certainly in developed markets, elderly people have more disposable income and more wealth. And as co-payment becomes more important, I think that trend is going to support increased healthcare expenditure. So, as everyone knows, we've been in a terrible recession, financial crisis. But how terrible really was it? Well, if you look at world GDP, what you see is a rather small 1 or 2 percentage points dip in global GDP in 2009. And according to this source, and The Economist will support this, I was looking at their data just today, world GDP is forecast to grow steadily at a compound growth rate of 5%, which is a pretty steady lick by developed market standards. Now, clearly that's being driven by a couple of major emerging markets, India and China, at about 8 to 9% forecast for next year. Will take a significant credit for that. But I think the future is looking reasonably bright in macroeconomic terms globally. Now, of course, there are many physicians in the room, and I don't want to start off a grand round. And trust me, the chest X-ray here is not the wrong way round. I checked. What that chest X-ray is not a brilliant quality film is showing is emphysema, and we have a patient there with cancer-related cachexia. It's clear to me, at least, that there remain very many very serious unmet medical needs in the world. In terms of smoking, I'm sure many of you are aware that about 20% of the world's population smokes today, and that figure is expected to increase. And one estimate reckons that during this century, 1 billion people will die of smoking-related diseases. Neurological diseases, dementia, schizophrenia, depression, remain very substantially untreated satisfactorily, not just in terms of pharmaceutical interventions, but of course across the whole range of healthcare. And I don't think you need to be a genius to work out that if 1 in 20 people today have dementia, and 1 in 5 people over the age of 80 have dementia, and the population continues to age, that is a massive challenge and a massive opportunity. And I haven't talked about this, but clearly this is also related to so much morbidity in the world that I think another great opportunity lies there. Perhaps not, bearing in mind we're in the Royal College of Surgeons, so much from, or just from pharmaceutical interventions, but potentially from surgical interventions. Okay, looking a little bit more parochially at prescription drug sales, many of us, or all of us, will have heard of the patent cliff, the innovation deficit, and all the other terrible things that are happening to the pharmaceutical industry. It's fair to say, though, that it is highly likely that despite the 100 billion or so of sales, which are dropping off the top lines of most big pharmaceutical companies combined in this year and the next, total prescription sales will continue to increase, and do so at a pretty healthy rate. Okay, so if that's the picture in which we reside, perhaps somewhat optimistically, what sort of innovations are relevant? What do we see happening? Well, there are lots, obviously, and I'm not going to spend long talking about them, but there continue to be innovative drugs brought to market. And Yervoy, I think, is one of recent approvals, which is such. And I think it's a very interesting drug with a new mechanism of action, indicated for melanoma, but with follow-up indications rapidly following, which I think is challenging the idea that the blockbuster is dead, because this drug is confidently forecast in the next 3 or 4 years to reach peak sales of over $5 billion. So unless something unexpected and bad happens, there is still room, in my opinion, for genuine pharmaceutical innovation. Now, this company, Panacea, as it's pronounced in India, biotech, is an interesting business because it believes fundamentally and ambitiously, not just in pharmaceuticals, but in integrated healthcare solutions. And this company, like Zeneca did in the 90s, has bought a hospital, or is building a hospital in Gurgaon, which is where our operations in India are, to deliver such integrated solutions to inpatients in this hospital. However, its vision is all about bringing innovation across the healthcare spectrum and not just playing as a pharmaceutical company. This organization is based in China and is developing a herbal through well-specified phase 2 trials in Europe to address 2 gastrointestinal indications. A Chinese company which is taking on the obligations of bringing a new pharmaceutical to Europe based out of a herbal active ingredient. And this company, in the spirit of neologisms, caught my eye because this company has invented a new word which is edutainment. This is based in India, and what this company, I believe, rather innovatively has done, using mobile telephony through a network which reaches 40 million people in India and which has successfully convinced 7 million people in India in 1 year to download this Freedom HIV/AIDS game. And I'll leave you to imagine how it works, but I think it's one of those things where you toggle your buttons on your mobile phone to move the little guy left and right to avoid the syringes and the death icons coming down, but with a very clear message associated with that. It doesn't strike me as being too much of a leap of faith to imagine that that type of innovative communication could be linked to other types of services, which this company doesn't currently provide, but which I believe in the developing world, in India, China, and other places where mobile telephony is really important, this sort of thing, I think, has genuine potential. Okay, what I'd like to do, and I will be as brief as I reasonably can, is talk about 2 areas of challenge and innovation, which I think perhaps represent some of the bigger areas of challenge but opportunity in the innovative pharmaceutical industry today. One of those is addressing the environment, the opportunities to innovate in the way in which drugs are developed, and the second is around how large companies might choose to operate and organize to be somewhat more successful within that environment. In a sense, I have my fingers burnt a little bit by projecting the future, so what I'm actually going to talk about more is about things which are already happening, and perhaps let the debate and discussion, as Chris stands up, talk more about how these things really are going to develop. So the first one is a discussion which some of you, or many of you, will be familiar with, about the challenges of the current R&D model for developing new drugs. And this is a reasonable representation, I think, of classic drug development, going through a series of linear processes, binary decisions, with a lot of expense, a lot of risk deferred to late in the process, and ultimately delayed access of drugs which, in my opinion, have not been appropriately or sufficiently characterized for their use ultimately in the real world. So something which I've been talking about with various colleagues and others is the opportunity to change that paradigm and how to do that, and how to become more effective at developing drugs in the real world using a patient-centric approach. What does that look like? Well, clearly it needs a high degree of multi-stakeholder collaboration. It requires different trial designs. It requires the ability to effectively use a range of different types of data sources other than the data source from a randomized controlled trial. And really importantly, for this to work well, it requires a lot of transparency and a lot of ability to look at data and analysis as it becomes available, not just within the sponsor of the trial, but across the various stakeholders. What is the opportunity? I believe earlier access to innovative medicines by well-informed patients, first and foremost, an ability to get a better understanding of how the drug performs really in the real world, with increasing confidence of the efficacy and the risk and the benefit and the value of those medicines. Earlier and better profiling of risk. And potentially, although very difficult to see right now, the elimination of much of the expense in current clinical development in large-scale clinical trials. I think in view of the time, I won't talk through this model in detail. There are many variants of what a real-world approach would look like in practice. I think to be general about this is actually missing the point somewhat, because each program needs to be designed with a very specific design, bearing in mind the characteristics of the patients that are receiving the drug and the drug itself. So, in the interest of time, I'll just mention a couple of initiatives which are pushing this agenda forward. Many of you will know these. UDIGS, based out of MIT. This is an acronym, not a neologism. The New Drug Development Paradigms group is doing some very interesting work, including in Singapore, in piloting these types of designs. And the FDA has approved a range of protocols for phase 3 pragmatic trials which reflect this type of methodology. And indeed, in the UK, an organisation called GPRD, part of the MHRA, has also FDA-approved protocols that are designed in this way. The Athenaeum Group, which many of you will have heard of, and now the ABPI, are driving guidelines for real-world development. One of my colleagues, Nick Edwards, in the audience here, is working hard to set up a University of Oxford centre for accelerating this and other types of innovations. I had asked Nick to say a few words on that. Nick, would you like to, or shall I carry on?
I'd be happy to. I've been working with Professor John Bell in Oxford and Richard Barker, who may be known to many of you, on establishing this centre with an initial focus upon addressing, at least understanding and trying to address, the pharmaceutical R&D challenge, which in a nutshell is, whilst we're spending a lot more money on medical research and there's a lot of great technology and understanding coming out, we seem to be getting fewer and fewer drugs out the other end of the system. And that whole process is getting longer and longer. It's 10 or 12 years. It's very expensive. It's up to $1 billion for every drug. It's hugely risky with massive attrition going on. At the moment, that's sitting fairly and squarely in the lap of the pharmaceutical industry. But our belief is that in order to really understand this challenge and address it, we need to go beyond just the pharmaceutical industry and understand the regulatory environment in which this is happening, the way governments reward pharmaceutical industries, looking at economic incentives and rewards, and the way that different countries collaborate. So the idea is to set up a centre with a small professional staff that will try to understand what these issues are, gather data, and develop policy recommendations, not just on the traditional pharmaceutical paradigm, but also thinking about what is the new systems that are going to come down the pipeline. There are things like cell-based therapies, bioengineered vaccines, bioengineered viral vectors. How should we as a community be regulating and incentivizing, and how would the system work? So the idea is to set up a permanently staffed group within Oxford that will bring all of those different skills together, including people from industry and regulators. And I recognize that it's a tough challenge, and this will probably take many years to really get our teeth into and address.
Well, good luck with that, Nick. Thank you. I think we did talk about debate and discussion, so I'd like to encourage that. But what I think I might do is try and reach the end of my presentation in the next couple of minutes and perhaps ask Chris to step up. And I think, Chris, you're going to challenge the audience with some of your own views on these subjects, and others, no doubt. Okay, so this is the other area. This is a really horribly simple analysis, so please don't take it too seriously. But one of the things that I did a few years ago with some colleagues and just refreshed recently was an analysis of how much money is spent on R&D by different cohorts of the industry, and then saw what came from that. And now there are lots of different pitfalls of that analysis, and I won't bore you with them. But this table shows 5 cohorts, the top 10, then 20, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and so on. The amount that's spent in those cohorts, and the number of NDA approvals that were delivered in this time period, 2009 and 2010. And what that horribly simple analysis shows you, which you can obviously take with a pinch of salt, is that it costs a lot more, it would appear, for big companies to develop and get these drugs approved than it does for small companies. Now, please take that with a pinch of salt. My hypothesis is, and there may be others that will disagree and others that will agree, is that scale is not always terribly helpful in delivering new drugs to market. In fact, sometimes, in many respects, it can be rather counterproductive. Many of you will have read J.P. Garnier's paper on this subject soon after he left GlaxoSmithKline, in which he made a range of arguments, which I'm not going to necessarily support, about the challenges within that organisation and others around bureaucracy, risk aversion, the difficulty in making decisions, the challenges with accountability, and really a sense of small is beautiful. So how far can we take that argument? Well, I think we can take it quite a long way, and I would actually advocate, bearing in mind there's a significant focus on talent, that one of the things that we need to do is not start thinking about that, but actually implement that in a range of different ways. So how to do that? Well, I believe it's quite relatively simple in many respects. Determine what you're good at, structure your operating units around that, and ideally keep them relatively small. Make sure each unit is accountable. Have a look at your leadership talent and what leadership talent you can secure, and put that talent in charge of those units. Invest in leadership, career development, succession planning, build skills, business, negotiation, customer and supplier management skills. Importantly, put in place an infrastructure which allows these units to interact financially, giving clear cost accounting and decision support from a financial perspective. Ensure, really importantly, that the people who are closest to these units, their leaders and their teams, are operationally free to make decisions. And then evolve this network as it develops. Now, okay, that sounds very simple. By the way, in terms of the linguistics, this is an argument which I've hesitated to make, but in this context I'm talking about disintegration in a positive way. So how far to go? Is it a good thing? Well, the classic vertically integrated pharmaceutical company of the past, somewhat illustrated in the top right-hand box, very illustratively, increasingly is being disintegrated such that functions are being broken out from global functions into functions organized by therapeutic area, equally by geography, equally by subspecialty, and ultimately, would it be possible to break up a company to its ultimate simplification of operating units? The military do this. Prehistoric societies have done this. There's an academic called Dunbar who believes the ideal size for a unit is 150 people. That is the maximum size, according to him, that people can form a genuine social network within an organization. So that's where I'm going to stop. A little bit challenging maybe about where the opportunities are in the industry, a little bit challenging for big pharma and other big companies in terms of how to approach organizing for that type of change. But at least some thoughts for you from my humble experience. Thank you.
Thank you.